Between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, Conan, destined to bear the jeweled crown of Aquilonia upon a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell thee of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure.
Hello, dear listener, and welcome to Conan Chronicles. In this podcast series, I'm going to be doing a review/retrospective on all things Conan the Barbarian I can get my hands on. Some things are out of print, some video games or whatever are not as widely available as they once were, etc. But for now, I guess I'll say I'm going to do a review/retrospective on most things Conan, such as the Marvel Comics series, the Robert E. Howard stories, and the films. In any case, I'm your host, Dan, and today we're going to begin with the original Conan. We're taking a look at The Phoenix on the Sword by Robert E. Howard, the first story featuring Conan the Barbarian ever published. This one made its debut in the pages of Weird Tales magazine, all the way back in December of 1932. So to briefly explain, for context for those who aren't familiar with what pulp magazines are, the pulps were sort of like comic books, but for novelists. A pulp magazine was typically made up of a variety of short stories written by different people. The common element between all of the stories in a typical pulp magazine issue was the genre. The publisher of the magazine would solicit stories from freelance writers in the genre of whatever magazine they printed. So for example, think of something like a Western magazine, a romance magazine, a mystery magazine, etc. Weird Tales was a publication that specialized in fantasy and horror stories. And in retrospect, Weird Tales is significantly influential. Some of the title's more famous contributors besides Robert E. Howard included legends like H.P. Lovecraft and Ray Bradbury. At the time when Howard created Conan, he had already been working as a freelance writer for Weird Tales, where he had created some other fantasy characters like Solomon Kane and Kull the Conqueror, who was somewhat of a similar character to Conan. In fact, some of the Conan stories that were eventually published in Weird Tales were originally Kull the Conqueror stories that the publisher had rejected previously. A bit after he had originally submitted the Kull stories, he rewrote them with Conan as the main character, and they were then accepted for publication later. This is true of quite a few of the original Conan tales, including The Phoenix on the Sword, actually. This one was originally a rejected Kull the Conqueror story called By This Axe I Rule. The original Kull story had a romantic subplot and less magical elements than the story as it was finally published with Conan as the lead character. When Howard first created Conan, he submitted a suite of 3 stories to Weird Tales featuring this new character. Along with Phoenix on the Sword, Howard also submitted The Frost Giant's Daughter and The God in the Bowl. Of these 3 stories, Phoenix on the Sword was the only one that Farnsworth Wright, the editor of Weird Tales at the time, chose to purchase from Howard. Wright had this to say of Howard's initial suite of stories, quote, "Dear Mr. Howard, I am returning The Frost Giant's Daughter in a separate envelope, as I did not care much for it. But The Phoenix on the Sword has points of real excellence. I hope you will see your way clear to touch it up and resubmit it. It's the first 2 chapters that do not click. The story opens rather uninterestingly, it seems to me, and the reader has difficulty in orienting himself. The first chapter ends well, and the second chapter begins superbly, but after King Conan's personality is well established, the chapter sags from too much writing. I think the very last page of the whole story might be rewritten with advantage, because it seems a little weak after the stupendous events that precede it." End quote. I thought that letter was interesting to read, as it shows the context in which Conan and many of these other pulp characters were created and developed into series after their initial inception. The writers like Robert E. Howard, who created these pulp characters, were under constant pressure to sell these stories to the publishers, so they could simply put a roof over their heads and food on their tables. Howard himself was a guy who fell in and out of writing professionally a few times before he was able to do it full-time. As creative as he was, even Howard and his contemporaries like H.P. Lovecraft were published only to the extent that their publishers found their work interesting. Sometimes all it took was doing things like removing romantic subplots or rewriting sections so that the editor didn't get bored. In any case, the final published version of The Phoenix on the Sword begins at the end of a meeting between a group of conspirators. These conspirators are plotting to assassinate Conan, the king of Aquilonia, the most powerful and prosperous kingdom in the Hyborian Age. Conan's grip on the throne at the start of The Phoenix on the Sword is tenuous. Prior to the story's start, Conan had overthrown the prior king, Numenides, by killing him and stealing the crown for himself. Conan was once loved by the people of Aquilonia, despite being born and raised a Cimmerian, for his victories on the battlefield as a mercenary in the service of their kingdom. However, after he stole the crown of the kingdom, many Aquilonians came to see Conan's rule as somewhat illegitimate due to his outsider, barbarian blood. In this opening chapter, we're introduced to the primary villain of the story, an outlaw named Ascalante, who is in the employ of the Aquilonian conspirators who wish to assassinate Conan and restore the kingdom's throne to a dynasty of Aquilonian blood. Ascalante himself is a shrewd and wily rogue, who has plans of his own to seize the Aquilonian throne after Conan's corpse lies at his feet. After the conspirators leave the meeting, Ascalante and his slave, a wizard named Thoth Amon, discuss their plot to exploit a member of the Aquilonian royal guard who is deep in debt and willing to be bribed. Ascalante says that the royal guard will lure the rest of Conan's personal security away from his bedchambers at night, leaving the king vulnerable and ready to be killed. Thoth Amon resents Ascalante and desperately wants to see his master die. However, he is magically bound as a slave to him. If he disobeys Ascalante, a magic spell will kill Thoth Amon instantly.
Conan will die. Dion will mount the throne. Then he too will die. One by one, all who oppose me will die. By fire or steel, or those deadly wines you know so well how to brew. Ascalante, king of Aquilonia! How like you the sound of it? The Stygian shrugged his broad shoulders. There was a time, he said with unconcealed bitterness, when I too had my ambitions, beside which yours seemed tawdry and childish. To what a state I have fallen! My old-time peers and rivals would stare indeed could they see Thoth Amon of the Ring serving as the slave of an outlander, and an outlaw at that, and aiding in the petty ambitions of barons and kings. You laid your trust in magic and mummery, answered Ascalante carelessly. I trust my wits and my sword. Wits and swords are as straws against the wisdom of the darkness, growled the Stygian, his dark eyes flickering with menacing lights and shadows. Had I not lost the ring, our positions might be reversed.
The ring that Thoth Amon speaks of in this passage is an enchanted ring of great dark power, known as the Black Ring of Set. During the course of the story, Thoth Amon recovers the ring and uses its dark power to summon a demonic servant of the evil snake god, Set. Thoth Amon directs this demonic servant to kill Ascalante. Meanwhile, King Conan is visited in a dream the night the assassination plot is to take place by a long-dead hero named Epimetheus the Sage, who warns Conan of the Set demon's presence in his kingdom before magically imprinting the symbol of a phoenix on Conan's sword. Conan wakes up to find that the phoenix had also been imprinted on his sword in real life, and begins preparing for battle, equipping his armor and arms right before the assassins burst into his chambers. The conspirators are surprised at finding Conan not half asleep and ready to be slaughtered like a sheep, but fully armed and ready to meet them. Despite being outnumbered and fighting alone, Conan rushes to meet his attackers with a barbarian's fury, killing many of the conspirators before taking a blow to his side, crippling him. With blood pouring from his wound, Conan still stands strong, ready to kill as many of the conspirators as he can before being slain himself. And suddenly, Set's demonic servant bursts into the room, interrupting the confrontation. The demon quickly dispenses of Ascalante and his men, sinking its talons deep into their flesh. The demon nearly kills the king himself as well, before Conan sinks his broken phoenix sword into the demon, killing it. The story ends with the wounded King Conan screaming to be served wine to ease his pain, and recalling the events of the battle to the servants of his court. The first Conan tale is a rather simple affair, a straightforward story of political intrigue, a plot to kill a king, and a cunning mastermind who comes close to succeeding, but is ultimately doomed by his own immorality and treachery. After all, Conan would have died in a glorious battle for his life that night, had the confrontation with Ascalante and his men not been foiled by the efforts of his disgruntled slave and the demonic servant of Set. The thing that makes this story stand out to me, at least, is the very strong characterization of Conan and the comprehensive feeling of the setting in which this story takes place. Conan's personality, which is one of the things that has sustained the character's popularity for almost 90 years at this point, is very well defined and established in The Phoenix on the Sword here. Conan's barbaric nature is a highlight throughout the entire story, but perhaps the best scene in establishing him as a person is in the second chapter, when Conan has a conversation with Prospero, one of his advisors, about how he views the burden of ruling Aquilonia.
"Prospero," said the man at the table, "these matters of statecraft weary me as all the fighting I have done never did." "All part of the game, Conan," answered the dark-haired Potanian. "You are king. You must play the part." "I wish I might ride with you to Nemedia," said Conan enviously. "It seems ages since I had a horse between my knees. But Publius says that affairs in the city require my presence. Curse him. When I overthrew the old dynasty," he continued, speaking with the easy familiarity which existed only between the Potanian and himself, "it was easy enough, though it seemed bitter hard at the time. Looking back now over the wild path I followed, all those days of toil, intrigue, slaughter, and tribulation seem like a dream. I did not dream far enough, Prospero. When King Nemetides lay dead at my feet, and I tore the crown from his gory head and set it on my own, I had reached the ultimate border of my dreams. I had prepared myself to take the crown, not to hold it. In the old free days, all I wanted was a sharp sword and a straight path to my enemies. Now no paths are straight, and my sword is useless."
Conan wears the crown of Aquilonia with a heavy head. He longs for the days of his youth, when he was fighting, killing, pillaging, and adventuring. The call of battle is what rouses him. He finds the business of ruling his kingdom boring and unfulfilling. He misses the days when the wars he waged were simpler, when problems could be solved with the directness of a sharp blade wedged between the ribs of his enemies. The business of navigating Aquilonian politics, the subtle tongue, the sophistry, the lies, and the deceit, These aren't things a Cimmerian, born and raised on the frontier of the frozen wastelands of the north, forged in the fires of battle, was made to do. Conan laments the horrific deeds of the prior king, but himself has done things that a modern conscience would perceive as unspeakable, namely killing a king in cold blood and taking the throne for himself. Conan's code of ethics reappears throughout the Howard Conan stories and later interpretations by other writers and artists, and it's shaped by the circumstances and time in which Conan lives. The Hyborian Age is set during the distant past of humanity's development on Earth, before the beginning of recorded history, where some tribes still tinker with stone tools and live as nomads. To survive and thrive in these brutal circumstances requires a certain barbaric ruthlessness that Conan possesses in spades. This is best demonstrated in the way that Howard describes Conan fighting during the climax of the story.
With a yell that rang to the roof, the killers flooded into the room, Gromel first. He came like a charging bull, head down, sword low for the disemboweling thrust. Conan sprang to meet him, and all his tigerish strength went into the arm that swung the sword. In a whistling arc, the great blade flashed through the air and crashed on the Bosonian's helmet. Blade and casque shivered together, and Gromel rolled lifeless on the floor. A dagger point raked along his ribs between breastplate and backplate. A sword edge flashed before his eyes. He flung aside the dagger wielder with his left arm and smashed his broken hilt like a cestus into the swordsman's temple. The man's brains spattered in his face. And in that brief respite, Conan leaped to the wall and tore therefrom an ancient battle axe, which, untouched by time, had hung there for half a century. With his back to the wall, he faced the closing ring for a flashing instant, then leaped into the thick of them. He was no defensive fighter. Even in the teeth of overwhelming odds, he always carried the war to the enemy. Any other man would have already died there, and Conan himself did not hope to survive, but he did ferociously wish to inflict as much damage as he could before he fell. His barbaric soul was ablaze, and the chants of old heroes were singing in his ears. As he sprang from the wall, his axe dropped an outlaw with a severed shoulder, and the terrible backhand return crushed the skull of another. Swords whined venomously about him, but death passed him by breathless margins. The Cimmerian moved in, a blur of blinding speed. He was like a tiger among baboons as he leaped, sidestepped and spun, offering an ever-moving target, while his axe wove a shining wheel of death about him.
Conan is not a morally upright character, like, say, a Superman, if we're comparing Conan to other adventure characters that have found widespread appeal in books, comics, and film. He has a closer resemblance to something like an anti-hero or a borderline heroic character with a dark streak, like a Batman in some incarnations, a Punisher, or a Daredevil. There's a streak of moral ambiguity to this character that makes this story and many of the other Howard stories really interesting. Conan's primary motivation is usually self-preservation and serving his own interests. So far as these things align with doing the, quote, right thing, Conan will do that. However, if serving these interests requires doing less stalwart acts of heroism, Conan will also embrace his barbaric nature. Robert E. Howard was a student of history and used what he knew about old conquerors and forgers of empires in our own mythic past to his advantage when writing these stories. People like Alexander the Great, the conquering kings of medieval Europe, and Genghis Khan were heroes to their people and brutal tyrants to those who they conquered. I myself am very interested in history. It's one of the things that attracted me to Conan as a character generally. So I had previously read historical accounts of men like Genghis Khan, who was a brutal warmonger. Conan sort of reminds me of one of these historical figures, and that gives the Robert E. Howard stories and the world they exist in a level of authenticity to the fantasy that I personally feel lacks in many other sword and sorcery worlds that came after Howard's work. The best Conan stories that Howard wrote really do feel like myths about an extraordinary man plucked from a lost era in humanity's past. If you change the names and the setting a little bit in this story, it reads like it could be a tale that Vikings or something told each other around campfires about a warrior king who was called to rule by destiny. Even though he longed for the days when he was raiding settlements with his fellow warriors, he ruled because it was his duty. One night, he's almost killed in his chambers by a group of conspirators, but by the intervention of Odin, he's warned of the danger ahead of time. Something like that. The Howard stories have a sort of epic fable feel to them, and I quite like that about them. Conan is a character who at times is a morally repugnant person to the modern eye. Genghis Khan and Alexander the Great certainly were said to have wreaked horrors before unimagined on their enemies. However, you can also see why stories about these mighty conquerors were told amongst their people. The actions of these conquerors had quite a large effect on the lives of their people. The mythic stories of these heroes shaped how Mongols, Greeks, Romans, any society that once had imperial ambitions, viewed the world. Conan's similarity to historical figures like Genghis Khan has not gone unnoticed by those who have worked on Conan since Howard's original stories either. In the 1982 Conan the Barbarian film starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, Conan paraphrases a famous Genghis Khan quote to a room of men dressed like Mongol soldiers, to cheers and applause.
Wrong! Conan, what is best in life?
To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of their women.
That is good.
Conan's characterization within this bleak conception of humanity's mystical past is not the only thing that aids in giving the story's setting authenticity, however. Howard introduces a variety of concepts for his Hyborian Age fantasy world in The Phoenix on the Sword that he would eventually flesh out more completely in subsequent Conan tales and his essay entitled The Hyborian Age. However, this story drops you into Conan's world, similar to something like the original trilogy Star Wars films or the Indiana Jones trilogy. Howard doesn't really stop to explain who or what the gods Mitra or Set are, or what the history of the kingdom of Aquilonia is. Howard provides the reader with just enough information about the world to be invested in the stakes of the story, understand the motivation of the characters, and make the world feel rich and alive. Conan, Ascalante, and Thoth Amon are the only characters with really developed personalities, and even then, Ascalante and Thoth Amon get way less development than Conan. Their motivations are clear and their voices are distinct, but some of the dialogue that catches the reader up on the various things that are necessary for the story to work can be a little stilted at times. Thoth Amon's recounting of his motivation in particular stands out as lesser writing, in my view, compared to the rest of the story's elegant descriptions and distinct voices for the three characters with the most involvement in the story. Thoth Amon outright explains his motivation and backstory partly in the story's opening chapter, and then elaborates in a conversation with a different character with much more detail in the third chapter.
Listen, my lord. I was a great sorcerer in the south. Men spoke of Thoth Amon as they spoke of Ramon. King Ctesiphon of Stygia gave me great honor, casting down the magicians from the high places to exalt me above them. They hated me, but they feared me, for I controlled beings from outside which came at my call and did my bidding. By Set, mine enemy knew not the hour when he might awake at midnight to feel the taloned fingers of a nameless horror at his throat. I did dark and terrible magic with the serpent ring of Set, which I found in a nighted tomb a league beneath the earth, forgotten before the first man crawled out of the slimy sea. But a thief stole the ring, and my power was broken. The magicians rose up to slay me, and I fled. Disguised as a camel driver, I was traveling in a caravan in the land of Koth, when Ascalante's reavers fell upon us. All in the caravan were slain except myself. I saved my life by revealing my identity to Ascalante and swearing to serve him. Bitter has been that bondage. To hold me fast, he wrote of me in a manuscript, and sealed it, and gave it into the hands of a hermit who dwells on the southern borders of Koth. I dare not strike a dagger into him while he sleeps, or betray him to his enemies, for then the hermit would open the manuscript and read, "Thus Ascalante instructed him," and he would speak a word in Stygia. Again Thoth shuddered, and an ashen hue tinged his dusky skin. "Men knew me not in Aquilonia," he said, "but should my enemies in Stygia learn my whereabouts, not the width of half a world between us would suffice to save me from such a doom as would blast the soul of a bronze statue. Only a king with castles and hosts of swordsmen could protect me. So I have told you my secret, and urge that you make a pact with me. I can aid you with my wisdom, and you can protect me. And someday I will find the ring."
Other than those three characters, the rest of the people involved are kind of exposition machines and soundboards for the principal cast to bounce off of, which isn't horrible or a deal breaker. I don't need every character to have an elaborate backstory or distinct personality necessarily, especially considering the short length of the story. However, it was noticeable to me, I have to say, as I was going through it. That's about the only real downside I can think of for The Phoenix on the Sword. Overall, I think it's an engaging, fast-paced fantasy story filled with intrigue, magic, and action with a touch of Conan's signature brutality. Howard's injection of historical perspective, to me anyway, gives the world of the Hyborian Age a level of authenticity that makes these stories extremely memorable. If you read the Howard Conan stories, you can tell why this character of all the pulp heroes has retained maybe the highest level of interest among the general public. I think that's probably true. It's a take on high fantasy that's brutal, matter-of-fact in its conception of what people of previous eras did in order to survive and forge mighty empires. The Hyborian Age is bleak in the same way that the Middle Ages were bleak, and the high period of the Roman Empire was bleak if you read about the actual things that happened during those periods in history. And if you're interested in reading stories that feel like myths about people who lived long ago, I think you'll enjoy The Phoenix on the Sword and much of Howard's Conan stories generally. The nice thing about the Howard Conan stories as well is that they're so old that they're in the public domain now, meaning they no longer have a strict copyright protection. I think all of the Howard Conan stories have been made into great audiobooks on YouTube by a variety of very talented people. There seems to be a pretty big community around it for the Howard stories. So for all of these reviews and retrospectives, I'll always include a link in the description to an audiobook version of the story I'm talking about, so you can check it out if this episode piqued your interest or if you want to listen to it before you watch one of the episodes. I hope you enjoyed my first review and retrospective on Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian. In the next episode, we'll be continuing on to the next Conan story in publication order, The Scarlet Citadel. I hope you'll join us for the next one, but for now, dear listeners, please consider supporting the show on Patreon. I'll provide a link in the description for that as well, and I bid you farewell.
Hither came Conan, the Cimmerian, black-haired, sullen-eyed, sword in hand, a thief, a reaver, a slayer, with gigantic melancholies and gigantic mirth, to tread the jeweled thrones of the earth under his sandaled feet.